All right, let's get right into it. So there is 1 in 5 Canadians that has a disability limiting their social participation, and physical disability is the most prevalent of them. Social participation is the degree to which one can perform their life habits, such as personal care or going to work, without difficulties and to one's satisfaction. Per the Human Development Model disability creation process that you see on the screen, social participation to life habits is conceptualized as being dependent on personal components such as one's abilities and disabilities, and environmental components that can be of a physical or social nature. This model of social participation is well known to practitioners of rehabilitation. It is a useful tool to understand the many components that affect the lives of people with physical disabilities. But how does this concept of social participation apply to disabled sexuality and more broadly to the field of sexology? In the recent decade, there's been a plethora of qualitative studies that have been published on the lived sexual experiences of adults with physical disabilities, and we sought to synthesize them to provide an empirical basis for the inclusion of sexuality in the HDM-DCP. More specifically, we wanted to identify which are the components that are related to the person, their environment, and their life habits around sexuality that practitioners in sexology and rehabilitation should consider when addressing the sexuality of adults with physical disabilities, thereafter referred as APDs. To do this, we conducted a framework-based synthesis using the HDM-DCP. We sought in the scientific literature studies with qualitative data from 2012 onward, as there is one other methasynthesis of qualitative studies that was published before covering the studies from the time period previous to that. 17 studies were included in our framework-based synthesis. So far, we have coded and thematically analyzed 12 studies, and I will be presenting the preliminary results emerging from these 12 studies. All of the analyzed studies are from North America or Europe, except for 2 studies that are from South Africa. Adult samples range from 18 to 60 years old. Half of the analyzed studies were dedicated solely to the lived sexual experiences of women, while the other studies included samples with a mix of men and women. Most studies had a sample composed of adults with a mix of different diagnoses, such as cerebral palsy or traumatic brain injury, while 2 studies focused on adults with a limb missing specifically, and 2 others focused on adults with spinal cord injuries. Nearly all of the analyzed studies were of a qualitative nature with in-depth or semi-structured interviews, except for 1 study that used mixed methods with an online survey that included a portion with open-ended questions. Here you can see the preliminary categories and subcategories that emerge from our thematic analysis of the 12 studies. They are organized following the HDM-DCP categories. You see the social components, which represent the environmental components of the model. You see the personal components, which represents the same personal components, and the sexual practices represents the life habits related to sexuality within the model. We found that the physical disabilities themselves were only a small part of the equation. Adults with physical disabilities reported that the societal belief that they are not sexual beings is still very much present and at the center of the lived sexual experiences. Through an internalization process, these beliefs were reported as having a negative impact on APD's sexual self-efficacy and perceptions of their own desirability. As such, this societal belief was very much perceived as a barrier to their social participation related to their sexuality. But APD reported that it could be overcome through normalization and representation of their sexuality and through their own personal process of self-acceptance and adaptation to their sexual practices. Thus, practitioners in sexology and rehabilitation should consider not only the impact of the physical disabilities on sexuality, but more so how do the other personal components interact with the social components, and how can their sexual practices be adapted and improved. It is worthy to note that there were no mention of environmental physical components, such as the impact of the bedroom environment on sexuality, and some categories did not reach data saturation. This could change with the completion of analysis, but most likely these are questions for future research, such as how do APDs manage the presence of personal care assistants at home in relation to their sexual relationships? What kind of sexual knowledge APD holds about themselves and what gaps should be filled? How can sexual aids be better adapted to the sexual needs of APDs? And finally, what kind of communicational abilities APDs should have to support their sexual exploration and practices with other partners.